Okay, good morning. And thank you for joining us for the joint CGD Land Model Working Group seminar. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing a presentation from Katie Dagon and Daniel Kennedy on the CLM5 parameter perturbation experiment. Katie's a project scientist too in the climate change research section of CGD. Her research focuses on impacts of climate change on land-atmosphere interactions and climate variability, as well as the utilization of machine learning approaches to climate science and modeling. And Daniel's also a project scientist in CGD, focusing on ecohydrology and the global carbon cycle. And during his PhD, he worked on integrating in representation of plant hydraulics into CLM5 model. Now, quickly before handing it over to Daniel and Katie, I'd like to remind everyone that we're going to take questions at the end of the seminar. And if you are joining us online via YouTube, or even if you're still on the internal Google Meet, please be sure to enter your questions into Slido, as we'll be taking questions from the in-person audience and then taking questions simultaneously by reading them from that Slido page. And the way you get to that is you just go to slido.com and then look for the CGD seminar page. All right, off to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. Just let me know if the mic's okay. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. So Daniel and I are going to split this talk into two parts. I'm going to start. We're going to talk to you about this experiment this project that's been going on for a couple years now, where we're using CLM5 to sample parameter sensitivity, uncertainty, and working towards automated calibration. So we also want to acknowledge contributions from Linnea Hawkins, Dave Lawrence, and the CLM5 PPE working group. So let's see if I can advance the slides. Okay. So I want to start from this graphic showing how land models have changed quite dramatically over time. I think some of you in the LMWG have seen this before from Rosie and Charlie's recent paper. But when we think back to where land modeling started in the 70s and 80s, basically as boundary conditions for the atmosphere, and we've added lots and lots of complexity over time. I was reflecting that we need to add an additional column for the 2020s now. And even this week, we've been hearing about all sorts of candidates for new sources of complexity that we want to add to the land model. I was making notes, just looking through the agenda. We've had talks about lake reservoir, river routing coupling, heat stress physiology, desert dust emissions, ozone damage, multi-layer canopy. So you get the idea. We're increasing this complexity beyond even what's shown here. And another thing we've been discussing this week is how we reconcile these increases in complexity with being able to understand the uncertainty that comes along with parameterizing those processes. And so another motivation for this work that we're going to talk about today is how that uncertainty in things like the carbon cycle propagates into projections that we're looking at with these land models, and how important that is, sort of thinking about how to understand what's going to happen with the carbon cycle in the future. So this is a plot many of you are probably familiar with in the LMWG. So this is showing projections using CMIP5 models. Each line is a different model, all forced with RCP 8.5 forcing. And the y-axis is showing the cumulative land-atmosphere flux. So not only do we see such a large spread across the models projected to 2100, but we also see a difference in the sign such that the land is simulated as a carbon sink for the positive values or a carbon source by the end of the century. If we look at the next generation models, so CMIP6 models, we do see some improvement in terms of, at least they're all agreeing on the same sign. Again, each line is a different model. This is not exactly the same scenario. It's a 1% CO2 scenario, projected out about 140 years. But we're still seeing roughly equivalent spread, so about 1,000 petagrams of carbon spread by the end of the century. So we'd like to sort of better understand why different models are giving us different answers when we project out. And there's been some work connecting the spread in these projections to uncertainty in land model structure, and in particular parameters, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And so this schematic here is comparing the different sources of uncertainty or variability between ocean carbon cycle on the top and land carbon cycle on the bottom. And what's interesting here is that you see that while the land and the ocean sort of start out with a similar decomposition of these different sources of uncertainty, the land model uncertainty, which is the blue piece, which is the structure and parametric uncertainty, retains the sort of dominant source as you look over time. Okay, so let's talk more specifically about why we have uncertainty in parameters in the land, and let's zoom in on one land model in particular, which is CLM, which is what we're going to talk about today. And so this is a schematic showing all of the different processes that we're currently representing in CLM. Again, we're even thinking about additional complexity in the future. And so why do we have sources of uncertainty in our land model parameters? Well, this comes from kind of insufficient observations in some cases, and also incomplete understanding of how to parameterize the physics, chemistry, and biology that goes into these models. I think the land in particular has a very large and complex parameter space, issues with regionalization, and also how to represent subgrid heterogeneity in the form of different plant functional types. So we'd like to be able to sort of understand how to quantify those different sources of parametric uncertainty in the land. And just to get everyone on the same page, I thought I would give an example of a particular land model parameter, just so you know kind of what we're talking about here. So I'm going to show an example that relates to the trade-off between transpiration, so the flux of water out of the vegetation, and photosynthesis, or the carbon uptake. And this process is called stomatal conductance. So again, LMWG folks will be familiar with figures like this, but just to get everyone else up to speed, if we focus on this particular process of stomatal conductance, where we know that the stomata on the surface of the leaves are important for taking up CO2 in order for the leaves to photosynthesize, but they also are a way of releasing water at the same time. So if we look at the data that's here from this Medlin et al. Paper showing stomatal conductance on the y-axis and a normalized photosynthesis on the x-axis, you can see that there's this relationship between these two quantities where you have sort of increasing stomatal conductance with photosynthesis. And the different colors are different forest ecosystems, so you can sort of think about fitting a line to these different plant types in order to parameterize this process. And it turns out the slope of this line is a really important model parameter. And so it's sort of representing the marginal water cost of carbon gain in the model. And this is the actual equation that's in CLM for this process. And this G1 parameter is that slope parameter. So a couple different sources of uncertainty here, both that we have different forest ecosystems that we want to represent with different values of this slope term. But because we also have scatter across the different colored points, there's also some uncertainty in how we fit that. So that's just one example of our parametric uncertainty in the land. So now let's sort of shift to talking about calibration or optimization. If we think about how we might fit these models to data, traditional hand tuning methods often take a lot of time, both human time and computer time, because we're sort of maybe updating one parameter, but that changes something else somewhere else in the model. So the analogy I like to use is the arcade game Whack-A-Mole, where you fix one thing and it breaks something else. Rosie has this nice figure sort of demonstrating how you're sort of slowly trying to move towards improving the model, but you might get all the, various distractions along the way. And just zooming out for a second, in terms of talking about model calibration more generally, I wanted to mention a couple of recent papers that I thought were helpful in thinking about this concept. And the 2 points that I want to make here are, one, that model calibration is important and, in fact, I think a key to how model developers learn about the model, but also that there's always going to be some diversity and subjectivity in the tuning process, and that's important to at least consider and be aware of as we go through this process. Okay, so when we tried to sort of list out what the barriers might be to doing this automated or systematically, here are some of the things that we came up with. It's probably not an exhaustive list. I've already talked about how there's interacting process complexity, especially in these land models. We have somewhat large and poorly constrained parameter spaces. Prohibitive computational costs. So if you want to calibrate, you often need to run large ensembles, testing different parameter values. that becomes expensive. We also have issues with spin up. That's not specific just to the land, but Daniel will talk a little bit about how we've tried to combat some of these computational costs. We also have uncertainty in observations and model structure, so how to account for those different sources of uncertainty when we're calibrating parameters. And again, as I mentioned previously, we have challenges in trying to remove some of the subjectivity from this tuning process. But if we then flip it around and say, okay, well, that sounds really hard, but why would we want to do this? What are the benefits to systematic model calibration? And so here are some ideas that we came up with. Again, maybe not an exhaustive list. So first of all, aiding in model development. If we want to be able to quickly test new parameterizations at different resolutions, coupling components, it would be nice if we had a way to sort of systematically or automatically calibrate the model to those different parameterizations. And a related point is also maintaining a hierarchy of model complexity. So again, being able to calibrate at different complexity modes. What I've listed here are specific to the land, so land folks will recognize these acronyms. Daniel's going to talk a little bit about the differences in the CLM complexity modes, but it's applicable to other model components as well. And the graphic on the right here is kind of showing how you might break apart different configurations of a land surface model, focusing on particular physics that you're interested in. Another important point, I think, is the ability to do actionable science. So if we had a systematic or automated model calibration tool, we could easily deploy this, or users could deploy this in different study domains, especially at sort of point or regional scales where they might want to calibrate their model. And at the same time, I think this also increases the model community and user base. So now that hopefully you're all convinced that we should try to do something like this, let's return to this sort of whack-a-mole analogy. And for the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about some work that we started a couple years ago, thinking about how we could use machine learning to systematically calibrate the land model. So this is the kind of basic setup here. We wanted to create a framework to be able to use machine learning-based emulation where we would learn the parameter response functions. So what I mean by that is we would take a set of land model parameters. Here, we're just focused on a very small set, 6 biophysical parameters. We retrained an emulator to predict, again, a specific set of processes. Here we're looking at variability in carbon and water fluxes. And how we trained the model, so this is in training mode, was we had to use a perturbed parameter ensemble. And so I just want to talk a little bit about what that is. I think many folks are familiar with this now, but it's still sort of important to get everyone on the same page. So when we say a perturbed parameter ensemble, we mean we're using different parameter combinations generated with Latin hypercube sampling. I'll talk about what that is in a second. So each ensemble member has a different set of these parameter values. And just to be very specific here, when I say the land model, we're running offline, global, but land-only simulations that are forced by atmospheric reanalysis data. And if you're not familiar with what Latin hypercube sampling is, I'm a visual person, so I just wanted to sort of show a toy example of these different sampling methods. So it's a way of more evenly sampling the parameter space that gets you a little bit beyond what random sampling does. So here is just showing 3 different parameters. If you sample randomly, these sort of distributions between 0 and 1, you can immediately see the visual difference between a random and the Latin hypercube sampling, which is taking into account previous samples to evenly sample the space. Okay, so I'm skipping over a bit here in the interest of time, but once we have sort of an emulator that we are convinced is skillful, and I can talk about, if people are interested, how we assess that, we can move from training mode to inference mode, where we take new unseen parameter values, feed them into the emulator, and then we get predictions from the emulator instead of sort of our verification during the training process. And so this graph on the right is showing a comparison in the blue between the original CLM PPE that we ran that had 100 members and the emulated value in orange. And so you can see sort of good fit there. And this particular metric is the first principal component of GPP, which is one of the quantities that we were interested in for this work. Okay, but I do really want to emphasize the increase in computational efficiency here, and this is really important for the calibration. In this example, the particular version of CLM that we were running, it was offline, it was fairly low resolution. It still took a couple of hours to run each simulation, whereas once we have a trained emulator, it takes seconds to generate the predictions. So it's very, very much increased computational efficiency. And then I also wanted to point out, because this is a sort of a machine learning application, and you might be wondering, well, why are we using this black box model? Do we understand what it's doing? So we can do some simple interpretability on these emulators, which I think is kind of a nice example. So this is showing variable importance or feature importance. And what this does is it tests out how the different parameters on the y-axis impact the skill of the trained emulator. So the x-axis is the mean squared error. The orange bar is the sort of original trained emulator skill, or mean squared error. And as you remove the information content from each parameter one at a time, you test and see how well the predictions are maintained. So when you see a larger bar, that means that that parameter is pretty important to the skill of the emulator. So what I thought was interesting here is that when you compare carbon and water flux variability, you see very different parameters emerge as important. And I know I haven't told you what these acronyms mean, but just to highlight a couple of those, this Kmax parameter on the left has to do with plant hydraulics, and the Medlin slope parameter on the right is the one that I mentioned at the beginning that has to do with stomatal conductance. So what this also allowed us to do was think carefully about whether we had defined the ranges appropriately for these parameters, in particular when it comes to how they vary with plant functional type. And we were actually able to go back and, for this next iteration that Daniel's going to talk about, really think carefully about if we were selecting these parameter ranges appropriately. So it's nice because it kind of ties back into the physics of the model and also understanding how to improve this process. Okay, but to get to the calibration stage. So once we have a trained emulator, we know it's very computationally efficient. We can sample many different parameter values. The plots that I'm showing on the top right here are our two targets, again, carbon flux variability and water flux variability. We have the original PPE in blue, the neural network emulated predictions in orange, but now I've added an observational target to each of those plots. So these are FluxNet observations. And we can ask the emulator to give us the best fit parameter values to those observational targets. Of course, we also have to construct some cost function in order to estimate the distance between the emulator predictions and the observations and minimize that distance. And I could probably spend a whole talk just talking about how we came up with that function in the lower right, but essentially, we're trying to balance multiple targets, multiple metrics, perhaps even uncertainty in our observations, and come up with something that gives us sort of what we think is the best fit. And then we can take those best fit parameter values and run them back with CLM. So again, we had been in emulator world. Now we can go back and run the model and compare and see how the performance changed. So in the lower right is the default model bias, so default parameters relative to observations. This is for GPP, or gross primary production. And then on the left is the optimized parameters. So we saw, one sentence summary of this work. We saw improvement in global annual mean biases, but the regional and seasonal results were mixed. And you can kind of see this comparing the bias plots, places where the colors got lighter or got darker. So this sort of led us to ask the question, what are we missing with this work so far? How can we improve? So here are some things that we were missing from the work that I've showed so far. First is we had a limited complexity version of CLM. Daniel's going to talk about what satellite phenology versus the full biogeochemistry means, but we were using the former, not the latter, for this work. We had very minimal sampling, so we only had 6 parameters and 100 ensemble members. We're going to vastly increase that space. The choice of metrics. So by tuning or calibrating to annual means, maybe we're missing some signals in the seasonal cycle that are important. The choice of cost function, again, how to account for different sources of uncertainty is important. And finally, the choice of calibration targets. So I was sort of talking about carbon and water fluxes. I had been focusing on sort of these two parts of the CLM diagram, but we wanted to also incorporate the biogeochemistry with this next stage. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel.
Thanks, Katie. Microphone's working okay? All right. Yeah, so what are we missing? One key thing is prognostic leaf area index. So what is leaf area index? It's the amount of leaf area per unit grid cell area. So on the left, plant A covers 40% of the ground area, so the leaf area index is 0.4. Plant B covers 80% of the ground area, the leaf area index is 0.8. So leaf area index is an important variable for CLM. 0.4, 0.8, those are actually really low values. You can actually have multiple layers of leaves, so more leaves than there is ground area. Closed canopy forest might have a leaf area of something like 4 meters squared per meter squared. A grassland, maybe something like 2 meters squared per meter squared. But then when you average in all the land with desert and sparse vegetation, the global average over land is about 1 meter squared per meter squared. Leaf area index is important in the land model because it is correlated with many environmental variables. It's determining a lot of CLM outputs like carbon uptake or fire emissions, but also things like latent heat flux and albedo. When you have prognostic leaf area, it responds to forcing like drought, temperature, human management, and CO2 concentration. So this is a pretty critical cog in the machinery of the CLM biogeochemistry model. CLM is set up to use either prescribed or prognostic leaf area index. So Katie's work was always satellite phenology mode, which is where leaf area is prescribed from satellite observations. And we're really only worried about the biophysical modeling. For this reason, it has an incomplete carbon cycle, and it's not particularly suitable for SSP simulations. Biogeochemistry mode maybe is like the workhorse mode of CLM. It has prognostic leaf area and full biogeochemistry. But that comes with a lot of extra parameters and a much longer spin-up burden. So our BGC mode needs about 1,500 years to spin up versus only 20 for satellite phenology. But like I said, this is our workhorse model and is what's typically used within the coupled model framework. Katie had 6 parameters in her Latin hypercube simulation. We've identified about 200 parameters in the BGC model, and we started getting excited. What if we sample all of them across all of these different processes that we're representing on land? And then that turned into, all right, but how do we sample all of them? And that involves identifying and defining parameter ranges, and then a whole lot of infrastructure development for parameter sampling, ensemble generation, and computational efficiency. Once we did that, we decided to proceed with a one-at-a-time ensemble of parameter perturbations, but across 6 different forcing scenarios. I'm not going to get into this too detailed, but stuff like a control climate versus low CO2 versus high CO2. Why is it important to run these different forcing scenarios? I'm not going to go into too much detail on this plot, but I'm just showing plant die-off. So here's an example where we set the Medlin intercept too high, and it killed almost all of the plants in our low CO2 forcing scenario. And the issue here is that it was harder for a plant to survive in 1850 than it is now because there's less CO2 and it's colder. But we really, for our transient simulations, we need the plants to survive from 1850. If one of our plants totally dies off in 1850, then we won't have it in 2020. So simulations that look good in 2020, maybe there's some path dependence and may not have made it through the early part of the historical period. So that's why we did some of these alternative forcing scenarios. But let me take a step back and talk a little bit more about how we generated this one-at-a-time ensemble. So we have 200 parameters. We pick a high value and a low value for each one. That gives 400 simulations. But if we want to do 6 forcing scenarios, we really need to do 2,400 simulations. And the big question is, can we afford to do that? At 1 degree resolution, if we want 10 years for analysis, it's about, say, 2,500 PE hours per simulation, relatively affordable until you factor in that spin-up. So if we need 1,500 years of spin-up, you're pushing into 300 PE hours per simulation. That won't mean much to some people. So let me say we're going to allocate 2 million PE hours overall for this effort. We're only getting 5 simulations. We wanted 2,400. So we can have the resolution that gives 4x the simulations, nowhere close. And so we've had to work critically on this, and we have great collaborators that helped us with this. One was to set up this alternative sparse grid spatial sampling, which is 400 strategically selected grid cells instead of doing like a standard lat-long low resolution. And then, so that got us up to 250 simulations. And then we have another collaborator who provided us this sort of fast spin-up method based on linearized biogeochemistry that can converge on equilibrium carbon pools. So we only need 140 a year spin-up. So this is what I'm calling like featherweight CLM, and it's only 5 P hours per year, only like, say like something like 1,000 PE hours per simulation. So much more affordable for this type of effort that we're doing. So now that we have featherweight CLM, we actually have to go through for each of these 200 parameters and define what range we're sampling. And this turns out, we have all of these different processes and no one person that's an expert across them. And so we set up Google spreadsheet, shared it with our collaborators, and kind of used groupthink and to set up ranges for each of these. Some of them are percentages, some of them are absolute values. We tried to include, where people had references for the parameter ranges, we left room for that. What's funny here is this now is like a really good community resource, having these priors for all of our parameters. And if you go to this Google spreadsheet, almost always there's someone up there lurking, trying to look at parameter values for whatever their experiment is. So that's fun. So now that we have the infrastructure and the priors, we generate this one-at-a-time ensemble. If Latin hypercube is the cool thing to do, why are we bothering with one at a time? And basically because it yields an easy-to-interpret data set. Katie mentioned that I'm interested in plant hydraulics, so the parameter I always look for is this Kmax. And so what does Kmax do to the model? I can just quickly look. High Kmax, leaf area index is 2.5. Low Kmax, leaf area index is 1.5. So it's a big lever on the model, and that's very easy for me to investigate. The other reason why one at a time is you can kind of see from this that many of our parameters have a small effect on any given output variable. I'm going to make this easier to see by sorting. So same data, but sorted. 140 of the parameters have less than 2% influence on LAI. So when we're getting into Latin hypercube stage, it doesn't really make sense to work in that really high dimensional space, which comes with a lot of problems if very few of the parameters are doing much. And so this ends up being a nice screening tool. And that's what we kind of consider the one-at-a-time ensemble to be kind of a screening tool in a community diagnostic. You can ask questions like which parameters have the largest effect on global leaf area, and we can pull up a diagnostic that shows you the top 8 parameters. So in this plot, I'm just showing the top 8 levers on global leaf area, where the dotted line is the default CLM parameters, and then you can see what a high value or a low value does for 8 of these top parameters. This is for global leaf area. We were also interested in kind of breaking this out on the biome level based on some of what Katie was showing, that it's hard to get global and biome right at the same time. And so the left panel, same type of plot here, but broken out for 2 distinct biomes that we're interested in. One is the tropical rainforest, and the other is the boreal forest, so like Canada, for example. You can see that these 2 ranking plots are almost completely unique. There's one parameter that overlaps, but generally very different for these 2 biomes. So if a researcher was more interested in tropical forests, they could filter based on the parameters on the left. If they're more interested in a boreal forest, they might filter by the parameters on the right. And that's where we're working towards, and what we have going now is these sort of mix and match parameter rankings. Leaf area isn't the only thing that we're available, it's what we're working on presently, but we have all of the kind of standard CLM output, and you can mix and match. You could look at photosynthesis, fire, energy fluxes, soil moisture. And you don't have to do global, you could do, like I was showing, biome or plant type. And likewise, you don't have to do mean. You could come up with any sort of scalar metric and look at what the parameter effect is. And likewise, repeat across different forcing scenarios. Mostly we're interested in scalar metrics because they're easier to kind of like plot up across a parameter ensemble, but we also have visualizations for looking at maps of parameter effect. So Katie called out the Medlin slope parameter. So this is the kind of spatial pattern of the Medlin slope effect on leaf area index. And we're getting really into these like interactive visualizations with drop-down menus where you can look across different variables, look across different parameters. And immediately this is becoming very obvious that this is, for a model developer, a really helpful kind of like smoke test where you think you know what a parameter does, but we don't often vary them one at a time, and so you can actually confront yourself with, like, does this parameter do what I expected it to do? And you can imagine that feeding into a model development workflow. For me, this has been really useful. So the one at a time deliverables, we created that featherweight CLM. We collated parameter ranges. We have an ensemble generation workflow and a Python analysis library. All of this stuff is hosted in a GitHub that Katie and I have worked together on. And then extensive diagnostics of CLM5 parameter sensitivity, which we're still working on figuring out exactly the best way to put that online. We'd like to have some of that interactivity still available online. And what we've found is that as soon as we got this project going, it created a lot of community interest. So this week is the Land Model Working Group meeting. We had 3 talks yesterday that referenced this one at a time perturbation experiment. We have 3 more talks this afternoon that referenced our perturbation experiment, and then 6 more projects that aren't giving talks specifically this week. And the people are coming at it from different perspectives. Some people are using the infrastructure, some people are using the priors, and some people are using the pre-screening. And we found that having all of those things made it a lot easier for people to do their own parameter sensitivity experiments. All right, so we did a one at a time experiment. Now it seems pretty natural to step up into the multi-factor ensemble. So we'll do parameter selection and then an all-at-once ensemble. The multi-factor ensemble, you might have guessed, is focused on leaf area index calibration. We picked this because it's a challenging but tractable problem, and it's a foundational variable within CLM5, the biogeochemistry model. We also picked this because it has good observational constraints. Satellites have been observing leaf area index for 30 or 40 years. Our experimental design, we have subset 32 relevant parameters, and we're going to do 500 simulations. The simulations are fully transient from 1850 to 2014, and like Katie described, we're using that Latin hypercube sampling approach. We're seeing this as kind of a pioneering project for us in terms of calibration, where we can learn and iron out some of the details here and then come back around to stuff that Katie was working on, which is more multi-objective calibration work. So hypercube in, hypercube out, which I think is pretty straightforward. But hypercube results are difficult to parse directly, right? It's really, the point of this is to make a figure that you can't parse from the audience, right? So we have 32 parameters varying all at once, and you might be more interested in what the kind of partial sensitivity to each parameter is. In order to accomplish that, we need some sort of emulation. Whether it's like straightforward regression or something more sophisticated from the machine learning world. So far with our leaf area index ensemble, Katie has done the work on the emulation. Linnea Hawkins is doing some of that too. We've found that Gaussian process regression is working the best for us at this point, but this is very preliminary and something that we'll iterate on throughout. But emulation is really important for backing out the partial sensitivity to each of our 32 parameters. And that's what this is. So going back to that Kmax parameter, this is photosynthesis instead of leaf area index, but they're they're very tightly coupled. So increased Kmax has a saturating effect on photosynthesis. And the reason I call this out is we don't get this from the one at a time ensemble, right? We would have just the low end and the high end, and you wouldn't know that there was a saturating effect. And when it comes to calibration, it's essential to know the true partial sensitivity across the range that you're willing to explore. And so Latin hypercube provides us the ability to identify nonlinear responses. The other thing that it provides us is parameter interactions. So again, one at a time ensemble, you don't know how Kmax and Medlin slope interact with each other or anything else. And you have to be able to predict that if you want a skillful emulation and skillful calibration. What this plot is showing is that actually most of our parameter sensitivity is in the quote-unquote main effects and not in parameter interactions, which will make the calibration a bit easier. And then this plot is showing the percent of variance. This sums to 1 over all the bar plots. But of our 32 parameters, the sum of the variance explained by all 32. We can flash back and forth, but what's reassuring here is that the top 5 parameters or so in our Latin hypercube transient simulation are really the exact same as were in our control one at a time simulation. And so that gives us some faith that our parameter screening was not missing anything, that we got the same rankings here. So now that we have global sensitivity analysis, we're thinking more about model calibration. And this is kind of where we're sitting now. We've done our exploration phase, we're working on our inference phase, and then we're going to move into the calibration phase. Katie worked on this stuff when she was an ASP postdoc. I worked on it when I was a postdoc, and now Linnea Hawkins is kind of taking over from the model calibration. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the challenges here, and Linnea is giving her talk this afternoon within the Land Model Working Group session. So if you're interested in more of where we're going from here, please be sure to check out her talk. There's, I think, 3 main challenges with our CLM calibration. It's the dimensionality, the equifinality, and then structural errors. I'm just going to focus primarily on equifinality here. But the first thing to note is that CLM BGC has a high bias in leaf area index. So the global leaf area index, like I intimated before, is about 1. CLM BGC, the global leaf area, is actually a hair over 2. And so within our PPE ensemble, can we resolve the global LAI bias? It turns out to be incredibly easy. No emulation required. Member 70 works straight out of the box. We wanted 1.03 for global LAI. Member 70 is 1.03 for LAI. So yeah, signed, sealed, and delivered. And so then you can ask, what does that parameter set look like? These parameters aren't necessarily meant to be intelligible to everybody, but I'll just highlight the top and the bottom. So F root leaf, that's the fraction or the ratio of root to leaf area. So a high ratio of root to leaf suppresses the amount of leaves. And then the bottom one is leaf longevity, how long a leaf lasts. So we're giving it a short leaf longevity and a high root to leaf ratio. That really makes sense to me why that would suppress leaf area. And so it's like, okay, high root to leaf, short leaf longevity, that's how you get LAI to be 1.03. That's member 70. Member 161 is just as good as member 70. It has LAI 1.04 instead of 1.03. And you can see that the parameter set is just like totally different, right? They didn't do high root to leaf and they didn't do leaf longevity. They found some other levers on the model that achieved identical results relative to the observations. There's no way we could choose one versus the other. So from this, the takeaway is that our parameters in terms of global leaf area index can really trade off against each other. We also have this like secondary dimension of leaf area index where we have 6 or 15 different vegetation types in CLM, and we have observations for what each of them historical LAI is. And so it's interesting to ask, like, if we have observations for all of these, we got global right with member 70, how did we do for each of the 15 vegetation types? And not surprisingly, there's big trade-offs, right? We're right on a couple of them, but most of them were, quite high or quite low, and they trade off against each other to achieve that global mean. And this is something that, Katie has run into with the satellite phonology simulations where you can achieve global results without necessarily improving regional results. So this is something we're thinking about as Linnea takes over in our calibration efforts, how to best leverage historical data to eliminate implausible parameters or implausible parameter sets. And this is one example of an extra layer of historical data that could be used to eliminate implausible parameter sets. So this is where we're at this point. I'm going to walk through this plot. So instead of leaf area, we're talking back to kind of Katie's first output or first motivation, which is the cumulative land sink. But this one only goes through the historical period up to 2014 instead of out into the future. And so the main thing here is that we have a very large range of the land carbon sink in the parameter perturbation experiment. This is just as large over the historical period as seen in a comparable ensemble of models. But now what we're trying to think about is, as from that last couple of slides, are all of these equally plausible scenarios? Or are there kind of constraints that we can apply to get a better estimate of what the historical carbon sink was and what the future carbon sink is? So right now I'm working on extending this ensemble from 2014 out to 2100 via one of those SSP type scenarios. And Linnea will be working on all of this sort of stuff, calibration and emergent constraints. But the overarching goal here, this is like a specific implementation of a kind of broader philosophy that we're developing here, and I think a lot of people are developing. We want to tune CLM5, get the best version of it that we can, but we're really taking our time with the infrastructure, both scientific and software, to create kind of like a repeatable insight generation machine. We're taking a fast model, confronting it with observations, using sound numerical methods, and our best parameter priors, running that through automated workflows, and trying to generate parameter insights. This could include things like better estimates of the land carbon fluxes, but also uncovering potential structural errors in the model in places where we need to do more work on either making the model perform better, making it a little bit simpler, or anything in that realm. And so this, for me, has been the overarching goal of this project. So just for summary here, Systematic model calibration is important to climate model development, yet hindered by a variety of challenges that Katie laid out. Land models in particular have large parametric and structural uncertainties, which impacts assessment of emerging climate features such as the land carbon sink. Machine learning emulation helps us optimize resources and reduce subjectivity for calibration. And then we think our CLM5 PPE community data sets are really valuable and are already resulting in many offshoot projects. They aren't even publicly available yet, and all of those offshoot projects are underway. We're making a lot of progress towards open source model calibration tools and are very interested in collaboration and not reinventing the wheel on some of our next steps. So with that, yeah, thanks. And Katie and I would take any questions.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, if you have a question, raise your hand. So we'll go to Rich and then to the other side. And then if you are online, you can use Slido. We've had a couple questions come in. So we'll also fit those in. Yeah.
So when you do
Oh,
these types of,
hold on.
there's no house mic.
Yeah, I don't. Are the ceiling mics on? No? So 1 second, Rich.
So for these types of projects, you get a lot of information out, and I'm wondering whether, if you were to, the example that you showed in terms of leaf area index, if you were to look at that, is there anything you could say, oh, that's a surprise? I didn't know that sensitivity existed. Because I know briefly on the atmospheric side, there's not a lot of surprises in terms of the processes that dominate. Such that if you went back to do the standard kind of lots of simulations tuning, would you do it differently?
What do you think?
Yeah, I think a couple things. So one, Daniel's point about how the sensitive parameters from the Latin hypercube ensemble were consistent with the one at a time ensemble is not surprising. And then two, yeah, we still, I mean, it's a lot of parameters to parse through, but we are seeing some familiar things pop up in terms of the important. But I guess, your example with the different ensemble members and how different they were in reaching that target is maybe a little interesting, and we could try and probe that space a little bit more in terms of, Daniel mentioned the root and the leaf trade-offs, but what is that other ensemble member doing that's getting a good observational target? Are there other parameters that we can look into there?
Yeah, and Linnea Hawkins, can you raise your hand? Yeah. Has already done some work showing that with just global leaf area, parameter posteriors are really not different than the priors. There's no filtering on the parameters for global leaf area, which I was somewhat surprised by.
Okay, thank you. So Ufuk has a question online. How can you be sure the machine learning generated parameters are physically realistic? You could minimize the bias such as surface temperature by optimizing one parameter, but maybe the way that you use to minimize will create an unrealistic result in the other variable like latent heat.
Okay. Yeah, I think if I'm understanding correctly, maybe a couple of things. One, we're not letting the machine learning sample outside of a defined parameter range, so that might be the first part of that question. But again, how we define those ranges is somewhat subjective, so that's important to always be sort of iterating on. And then, of course, yeah, the point about trade-offs, that's why we want to do this multi-objectively. So Daniel focused a lot on leaf area index because that's our first target. But what I saw was the trade-off between GPP and latent heat flux was even difficult to sort of constrain. So we do need to do it multi-objectively. Do you want to?
Yeah, and I think the only thing to follow up with there is that we're doing calibration all the time anyway, and we're faced with all of these problems. We just don't do it as exhaustively, and so you don't notice how many trade-offs you're navigating all the time, but we're already doing it. So it's not a new problem. It's just something we're facing in a more kind of complicated space.
Yeah, relating to observational error, I'm wondering how satellites can observe leaf area index greater than 1. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I'm not an expert, which is a great question. Yeah, it's difficult, but leaves have a very strong signature in terms of spectral information. Maybe you know a lot about this, but in terms of their spectral signature, they're really bright in one area and really not bright in another of the visible spectrum. And by differencing them, you can get a good sense of how active the vegetation is, and especially in their pigmentation. And that pigmentation tends to correlate well with leaf area index. So there's like a model in between, is the short answer.
Okay, thank you so much. No, very interesting. Well, this is a quick comment, but I think maybe you could say, if I understood your root index correctly, I think the right one had 4 or 5 parameters on the maximum of the parameter ranges. So that could be used as a criterion of saying, oh, this is maybe a less physical one than the one on the left, where arguably it was 1, but not even. My comment really, so I'm an atmospheric scientist, and they are looking into model error. What we're seeing is if you get a parameter wrong, let's say entrainment over the maritime continent, within 6 hours, you have this is a spread to, all over the West Pacific, and within a few days, you change the Walker circulation. So in the atmosphere, we have this effect of upscale error growth that then leads to compensating model errors. And there is a subset, a field in the atmospheric sciences where we look at very short time scales, where we nudge the model to the observations using different parameter setting, and then saying the one that requires the biggest nudging tendencies are the most unrealistic ones. And this is an attempt, or if your nudging is 0, then you have the perfect model. And this is an attempt to learn those parameter errors on very short time scales. So my question is upscale error growth an issue in land modeling? Is it really all local? And are people, rather than running out to equilibrium, maybe looking at shorter time scales and effects of parameters on those?
Yeah, it's a great question. We were just at this LEAP meeting in New York, which is like machine learning for applied to physics, and everyone there was very interested in our inference cost for the model and how long we really had to run. So I think that's kind of how Linnea is funded on this, is through the LEAP project, and there are a lot of people who are thinking about that in the broader group, and we're hoping to entrain some of those ideas and concepts into our approach too.
Yeah, I guess what I'll add to that is that we are somewhat probably subject to the atmospheric forcing that we're using in all of these. Really, maybe not exactly, but related to your question. And so we have had conversation about how we would sample that source of uncertainty, because these are all forced with the atmospheric reanalysis. And then that also relates to a discussion we had yesterday at the LMWG about how we move from single model to coupled model calibration, because the parameters are likely going to change. So just other fun things to think about. Yeah.
Okay, and we have a question online from Sophia. So can you elaborate a bit more on how high, low values are determined for each parameter PFT? Do parameters that are highly uncertain tend to have an outsized impact on model output variables because those parameters need to be varied over a larger range as compared to parameters that have low uncertainty?
Yeah, so Daniel touched on this when he showed the Google spreadsheet snapshot. So we are very intentionally not using the same sampling strategy across the different parameters, and the question is spot on that probably leads to some being more sensitive than others because their ranges are defined larger, and that has to do with the inherent uncertainty in those parameters. In terms of how they were determined, it was a large collaborative effort spanning expertise across different components of CLM and trying to gather that information.
But I do think it's a good point, because ideally we would be 2 sigma on every parameter, and even accounting for covarying probability density, that sort of stuff. It's just impossible, unfortunately, with our stuff. And so you have to work always from the assumption that these parameters aren't equivalently sampled. And that's where I think some history matching type of approach for refiltering samples after the fact comes in, where you constrain yourself to reasonable simulations, and then you can make some of your inferences in that subset of the ensemble. There is not a ton of inference you can do with the whole ensemble because of that issue of asymmetric parameter sampling.
So I have a couple, it's like two half questions related to the sort of iteration and sort of improving as you go along. So you've been doing this for a while now. Katie, you did one, made an emulator, and then more work is done. Did you take, as you were doing the one by one, did you start looking at what you would predict these values that you had not sampled would, like, use your emulator to predict that value? Because essentially it's a prediction of a prediction, and the new values being added informs you of how well your emulator is predicting your model, and you can sort of figure out then how well am I emulating between the actual sampled values as you go along. Do you do any sort of and apply some sort of uncertainty? Have you done that, or do people do that? Do you not need to do that?
Well, I guess practically, because my ensemble was trained on CLMSP, it wouldn't be a direct mapping to some of these newer simulations that we have. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't use that sort of framework to, maybe I'm not 100% understanding what you're asking, but like, because we expanded the parameter space, looking at how those new parameters impact the emulation. Is that sort of what you're asking?
Just so that you have at the end, when you make your emulator, it's a hypothesis. And the question is, as you do more, if you go on from there and are doing more experiments, you can use that to see how your emulator is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And
Maybe I can comment a little bit, which is, Latin hypercube is pretty naive because you're sampling all those 500 or 100 before you're getting any results. But we have talked a bit about employing some sort of more active learning approach where you have a more iterative response where you do 100 simulations, you try and figure out where your emulator is bad, go back and resample some of those areas, learn and iterate a bit. I don't know if that's getting at where you were.
That's good. The second part is just, if you are, if you have, gosh, I'm losing the wording on this. I had it formulated, sorry. Maybe I'll just turn it over to somebody else and I'll ask you afterwards because it's getting very close to the top of the hour.
Okay, it looks like we have a couple questions on the other side, so let me make my way over there.
Hi, great talk. I was wondering, you were talking about these like offshoot projects, but I was wondering if you have some sort of effort to, you just mentioned like everyone's calibrating this model all the time. Like, do you have an effort to like try to have people who do calibrate this model for different things kind of give you their parameter uncertainty sampling from their own calibration and kind of use that to inform your efforts for these for this experiment?
Yeah, we don't have a pipeline at this point to re-ingest offshoot stuff, and that's one of the challenges of being a community model. But it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah.
Great talk and great project. You mentioned structural uncertainty and structural errors in the model, and I was wondering, can you use this sort of framework to identify structural errors in the model or processes that aren't being represented and say, you've got all these parameters and you can tune up what you've got, but how can you use this to inform sort of model development, I guess, my question.
Yeah, maybe I can comment on that. So our leaf area index is 2 in the model. I'm not involved, in CLM5 calibration up until now, but I think it's that for a reason. I think it was accomplishing something else in the model, and I'm suspecting that when we push it down to 1, we're gonna
break something,
like uncover something that's not working and not be able to hit the target on multiple things. And I think that will point me towards saying we have a bit of a structural error that we can't achieve, call it leaf area index and GPP correct at the same time, and then looking into something in our allocation or phonology or whatever. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I believe we are at the end of the hour, so let us thank our speakers again. Okay. Okay, and just a quick reminder, if you are participating in the land model working group, you can lunch around the corner in the cafeteria, and the meeting will reconvene at 1 p.m. In this room. Thank you.